So yes, we're MAST, formerly known as MAST ICT. We're partners with Donorfy, founding partners with Donorfy. So we've been involved with the product for quite a while. We're all quite techy, so this sort of thing was quite exciting for us. We've worked quite a bit with the API over the years, and we've done a number of integrations with different clients' Donorfy systems. So we're going to be talking a little bit about the API today. This is a rough idea of the structure we're going to go through. So we've got an introduction to API, what it is, including the basics of the Donorfy API. So from a Donorfy specific point of view, we'll be looking at the configuration side of things in Donorfy, where to find the API documentation, some tools that you can access for using the API. So just as a few examples, we've got Microsoft Power Automate, previously known as Flow, which many people have access to through Microsoft 365. And you've also got Logic Apps, which is the more techie side of things through the Azure portal. You've got Zapier, which you may have heard of, and Donorfy are going to be working on integrating more thoroughly with that in the future. And we've got Postman, which Kylie and Stuart will both touch on in their side of the presentation. Then we've got some inspiration for using the API, so things we've done with it, and ways in which you can use the API to integrate from external systems into your Donorfy system. And then we'll have some Q&A time at the end, as Lucy mentioned. So, what is an API? API stands for Application Programming Interface, which basically means it is a way of talking to your database in a structured and logical manner. The API then does all of the hard work for you. It does the complicated programming side of things for you, and you can generally interface with your data in a fairly sensible way that you understand. So you've got a few different types of calls. You've got get, which is for retrieving existing data. You've got post to insert new data, put to update existing data, and delete. So these are standard functions within any API. Something we'll talk about a bit is unique identifiers, which become quite important when you're working with an API. It's all very well knowing that Harry Potter is in your database, but if you want to know exactly which record we're going to be interacting with, you'll want to know his unique identifier in the database. So you've got a few different ones that are important when it comes to APIs. You've got your API key, which identifies your unique Donorfy tenant. As you know, most Donorfy clients sit in a shared environment in the Donorfy database. So everybody's data sits together and it is identified by a unique tenant reference. And we'll have entity IDs as well. So each specific entity within Donorfy, each constituent, each transaction, each activity, everything will have a unique identifier. So the basics of what we're trying to achieve are you'll have your external system, could be your website or a booking system or anything any other system that you've got, and you'll have your Donorfy database. And in your external system, you'll have trigger event. So something will get created or updated or deleted, and you then want that to reflect as a change in your Donorfy data. In a little bit more detail then, that middle bit becomes your integration. So that clever yellow box there represents what we're looking at today in terms of developing integrations with the API. So you'll have your trigger event, a new record, for example. Your integration will then pick up that event information. So these are technical events we're talking about, creation of data or altering of data within your external system. So this could be done through a webhook, which is fired by the external system. Not all external systems have these. This tends to be for applications that have an API themselves. So you may have seen this in Donorfy, for example. This fires a message on particular events. So when something is created or updated or deleted, it can fire a webhook, which can then be picked up by your little integration. You can also have something that polls, so runs on a schedule, for example. Perhaps once a day, it will go through and find anything that's been created, changed, or deleted in the last day. And then it will take each of those records and go through the next steps. Or it could work on a data file. So similar to exporting your data from the external system and then importing it into Donorfy. Instead, you would import it into this middle step here, and then your integration can do something a little bit more complicated if multiple things need to be done with that data, as we'll see next. So what we're going to aim to do is use a unique identifier from that information. So, for example, if it's a new person who's been added into your external system, it could be a unique reference within that data to identify the record, and that can be used within an API to retrieve more data from each system. So this is just an example. It may not be necessary at all. So you could use that to then pull more data from your external system, including somebody's address. So you could use one of your commands to pick up additional data about that person who's been added to your system. And you could also query the Donorfy database also through the API to pick up information as to whether that record already exists in Donorfy and whether the address matches. That's just as an example, just to try and show what the general flow of an integration would do. At that point, you can apply all of your business process logic for what needs to happen to that record in Donorfy. So, for example, if the record already exists, it will probably need to update that record. If the record doesn't exist in Donorfy, it probably needs to be created. You can also have your downstream things from that. So if you want to add tags, activities, or recurring payment instructions, you can have all of that in a particular flow within your integration. And all that will mean is some additional API calls to do your posting into Donorfy for those entities. And ultimately, what this is aiming to do is create, update, or delete records in Donorfy. That's the upshot of it. Something will happen in your external system. It will go through a load of logical processes within your clever yellow box here. And ultimately, that affects the data that's in Donorfy to do whatever you need it to do. Here's an example of a real integration, and Stuart will probably show you this in more detail later. So this is within Logic Apps, the Microsoft tool, which is in Azure. So this HTTP request up at the top here, this is the first step from the integration. This is where we're picking up the event information. This is through a webhook. So that fires a message across to this particular item within the Logic app. That listens out for the webhook saying something's happened. So then it triggers off the rest of the process. And then we've got some further logic down here. Stu will show you this in a bit more detail. But this is just to show you what that might look like in the real world. It's a lot more colourful and pretty. So on to unique identifiers then. So we've got Harry's record here. If we know that this is the record we want to be interacting with in our Donorfy database through the API, we need to have a unique way of identifying which record we're going to be interacting with. Now we can see he is lucky number 13 as a constituent number, but because he sits in a shared environment, within that table in the database, there will be hundreds of number 13s, depending on the number of other tenants that are in that database. So all of the other clients may have a constituent number 13. So using that isn't going to be necessarily unique. Neither is his email address, because perhaps he donates to multiple different charities. Perhaps somebody else uses his email address. Perhaps you've got duplicate constituents. So this big, horrible combination of letters and numbers at the top is a GUID. So this is a unique identifier, and this will guarantee that you are interacting with this exact record. You might have noticed these in your URL box at the top of your browser. Not all entities within Donorfy have these particular URLs, but here we can see this is a constituent, so the entity type is constituent, and the ID is displayed here. And as I say, each entity within Donorfy will have one of these unique identifiers. It's sufficiently long and horrible that there are millions and millions and millions of them, and you don't need to worry that they won't be unique. Another concept within the API that we need to be aware of, don't worry about this, it looks a bit scary, but this is JSON, which I had to look up what it stands for. JavaScript Object Notation is a way of representing data that allows you to define a particular model and group everything together as a sort of flat list. So here we've got an example, and we could get rid of all of this white space here. So any of the line breaks, any of these spaces, these are just for allowing ease of reading. It could just be a huge long string of all of these bits of information. But what this essentially means is you've got comma separated sets of key value pairs. So here we've got commas at the end of each line. And then we've got a key. So first name is the key for this particular line, and the value is John. And we've got a colon in between. And each record within here is surrounded by these curly braces. We've got a few different data types in here. So we've got, this is what's known as a string. So it's a text, a bit of text. We've got a number here for the age. We've got some arrays, but don't worry too much about those. This is just to show you what language the API is communicating in, and to say, don't be scared of it. It is simpler than it looks, and there's lots of information out there on the web to help you understand JSON a bit better if that's something you're interested in. So you've got a bit of a checklist here for how to get started with the Donorfy API. So within Donorfy itself, what do you need to do to get set up in order to use the API? First, you'll need to enable the Donorfy API. So this involves raising a support ticket with Donorfy. If you are on one of the older pricing plans, this may affect your access to the API, but all of the new licenses, I believe, come with API included. Perfect. So that is very quick. It just means you'll activate your API access. Then next, you'll need to locate your API key. So that's within your system settings. You've got a 10-digit code of letters and numbers that allows your API calls to identify which client, which database you are interrogating through the API. And you'll also need to configure specific permissions, so API settings within Donorfy. And that looks a little bit like this, and Kylie will show you a working example of these a little bit later. So you'll end up getting a key, which is a big long password, to allow you to authenticate and make sure that people can't just make API calls to your database without you having given them permission beforehand. You can also restrict this by IP address. So this is to improve security. The documentation is available at this website. It looks a little bit like this. So we can see here we've got those 4 functions I mentioned before. So we've got our delete, get, put, and post. And if you click on each line, it will expand and give you more information about each of the calls that you can make. So here you can also see this little curly bracket API key. That is where you would put your 10-digit API key from your system. And then this ID at the end here would be the unique identifier, that big, horrible, long number for the particular entity you're looking at. So in this case, it would be the activity ID. But when we were looking at Harry earlier, that would be a constituent ID within the constituents section of the API documentation. There are lots of free tools available online. That comes with a bit of an asterisk, because many of them have processing costs that are based on usage, but this will be quite clear within each of these tools, and the terms of service within each one. So there's just a few examples over here. We've got Integromat, Zapier, Postman, Azure Logic Apps, Microsoft Power Automate. These 2 are Microsoft, but there are many more. You could use PowerShell to write API calls if you want to. You can use C#, any of your favorite programming languages can probably make an API call. These just make it a little bit more accessible, a little bit prettier, and each has its own pros and cons. There's no right way or wrong way. It's just partly down to personal preference, but also the balance of those pros and cons for your particular organisation and requirements. A lot of these allow you to build an integration in the cloud without any specialist software required. You can do a lot of this in your browser. So it's a sort of drag and drop almost of little elements for each of these. And they've got reasonably friendly interfaces to simplify their usage. Just to be aware, these do have security implications. There is a security implication with any API programming because it is giving you a way to interact with the data in your Donorfy system. Those security implications are a bit too complicated to go into here, but there are ways of mitigating those risks, and the Donorfy documentation will help you to identify where those risks lie and how to mitigate those. Now, over to Kylie.
Hello. Let me just share my screen. Right. So you want to start working with the API. You'll need something to test it. You don't want to just go diving in and throwing your API calls into whatever you're using without having some idea whether they work or not. And a great tool for testing that is Postman. There is a free version of it. You can download it from their website, and it's good for learning the basics of API, working out what kind of calls you'll need to do in your business logic, and testing things out. And this is what it looks like. These are the API calls that Sophie talked about with the get and post, which are two different kinds of calls. You can group them together in a collection. With your API calls, you'll want to set up the authorization. And in Postman, there's several ways you can do this. Probably the easiest way to do it is to set it up at the collection level. This is the authorization. You put your name in there. That's just used by Donorfy to let them know who actually did the update. And the password here, which you'll set up in Donorfy. And that is in your settings. If you go into your settings and search for API, it will bring you up with this. So I here have a permission set up for Postman. So with that access key and the API key, which Sophie showed you earlier, you have absolutely everything you need to get into, query and update MAST's test Donorfy system. So what I'm going to do at the end of this call is I'm going to remove this permission. This is the big security for your Donorfy system when using the API. So don't go handing these out to just anyone. So once I've set that up in Postman, I can query our API. There's another way you can do that as well. If you're using the API calls in the real world, you'll want to encode the name and the password in base 64 and set that up as part of your headers. And the API documentation goes into how to do that. So the components of the API call which the documentation goes into as well, are the URL, and this bit here is standard for all API calls. This is MAST Demonstration Databases API key, which you can find in your system. And this bit here is particular to each API call, and you'll be able to find that in the documentation, which will become your Bible if you're going to be looking at API calls. This is the get that I'm going to demonstrate, and we're first of all going to look at getting all the lookups that you can change and query when you're using the API. So this is querying our MAST database. This is the JSON that Sophie demonstrated earlier. It returns a list of all the countries, and this is Donorfy's basic list of countries. So there's not too many there. There's a few obvious omissions. So something that you might want to do if you're adding a new constituent, for example, there's a they come from a country that's not in your list, so you'll want to add it. So to do that, you set up the body of your request with the same kind of JSON that we saw that was sent back in the get. We'll add just a random country here. So that has gone through to our Donorfy. It's added a new country. It's returned the unique ID, which is the country identifier. It will return an error message if something goes wrong. And now if we go back to the get and send that request again, you can see that Donorfy has now Australia at the top of the list, as it should be. So this is a good point to remind you that Donorfy doesn't come with a test system. This is real world data. If you're adding a country, your Donorfy will show that new country. If you're adding a constituent, the Donorfy will show the new constituent. If you're deleting a constituent, it's gone. If you're doing a bulk update of several hundred constituents and you make a mistake, that's going to be very hard to fix. And yes, I speak from bitter experience when I talk about that. When you're testing, make sure you test really well. And yeah, Postman's a great tool for doing that. So, one of the things that you'll probably want to be doing if you're using the API in the real world is working with constituents. And one of the API calls is a nice, handy search tool. So for example, in our Harry Potter database, we'd like to find a Weasley. You set up a parameter, which you can do here in Postman, and it will be reflected in the URL. We do a search for a Weasley, and it returns a JSON list with all the Weasleys we've got in our system. There's quite a few there. We've got Bill, who's an individual. We've got Charlie. We've got a different constituent type here. The Weasley family is a household, but each with its unique constituent ID. And if we're using this, we might want to say find Ron Weasley, who'll be a different constituent ID, and then we can find another constituent, find that particular constituent with another API call and get more details for Ron, or possibly update some details for Ron. The logic in the API calls is fairly basic. You can do things like search for a constituent. That's one of the more sophisticated ones, or you can call a constituent from the constituent ID. You can get a list of the constituents' activities and that sort of a thing. But generally, if you want to do something fairly complex, you're going to have to either build the logic in your application, or you can build the logic in Donorfy. And this is one of my favorite API things. you can set up your lists in Donorfy and use the logic in your lists. This API call gives you a list of all the lists. So there we are. We've got all the lists we've got in our test system with their unique identifier. Say we wanted to get a list of all the active recurring payment instructions, which is something that comes up quite often. To do that in the business logic would be fairly complicated. However, you can set that up in Donorfy or get your friendly consultants like MAST to set it up for you, and then you can find the results. For example, we have here the active recurring payment instructions list that Sophie has set up. So if we wanted to get all the recurring payment instructions, all we need is the identification of this list. You can do another call with that list ID. And we have a list of all the recurring payment instructions. From here, you can go through, look at each recurring payment instruction and get the details on that. If you wanted to have a look at the constituent that set up the recurring payment instruction, you've got the constituent ID there as well. So you could call the get for the constituent using that ID and do whatever you wanted with that. So Postman, very useful tool, but only for testing, not what you want to do in the real world. Sophie's yellow box with the business logic is where you're going to be doing most of the work if you want to set up an actual API integration. And we have an example of that here. This is one that I worked on. Donorfy asked MAST to provide an integration for Life Church between Brushfire, their event management system, and Donorfy. Life Church is an organisation that runs several events with a large number of attendees each year, and they wanted to ensure that the details of their event attendees were held in Donorfy. This one wasn't triggered by webhooks or anything like that. We did an actual WinForms application, and the Life Church person went through all the Brushfire attendees that have been created in bulk and checked them and added them to Donorfy at the push of a button. So Brushfire and Donorfy both provided APIs. They are similar in that they both have a web front end with no direct access to the database. Life Church is using the Donorfy shared environment. If they'd been using their own Azure, they would have had access to the database, in which case we would have done things a bit differently. But in this case, we had to use the Brushfire API and the Donorfy API to work together. So the Brushfire API is similar in concept to pretty much any API, including the Donorfy API. Here you're working with events and attendees rather than activities and constituents. So we use the API calls from Brushfire to get a list of events and then details from one particular event that was selected by Life Church, and that would be the list of attendees. So the Donorfy API, we're using some of the things that I demonstrated here. We used a lot of the constituent calls. We wanted to search for the constituents, add the constituents, or if there was an existing constituent, update that constituent. We wanted to add a tag to the constituent and update their contact preferences. We wanted to check what activities that constituent had done to see if we were updating their activity rather than adding a new one. We wanted to add the activity if it wasn't already there, or possibly update the activity. Working through the settings, we wanted to get the lookup values for the Donorfy from the Donorfy config. we wanted to add the Brushfire events as campaigns. We wanted to add a tag to the Brushfire events tag category for the new event. And if the attendees were missing that country, we want to add that country. So the big part of the yellow box here was the deduplication. I'm pretty sure everyone using Donorfy knows what a pain it is if you've got duplicate constituents. So we wanted to make absolutely sure that there weren't any duplicates. Originally, Life Church said that the email address used will be the big tool for deduplication, but it turned out that a lot of people do event bookings using someone else's email address, or families all book on with the same email address, so that proved to be not so useful. So if we found duplicates or couldn't find a constituent with the email address, we'd look via postcode or phone number and town. And then we'd have possibly a match, possibly no matches, or possibly several matches. So if we found a match, we'd want to look at it to see whether it was that exact constituent. And to do this, we saved the event ID and the attendee ID on the constituent's activity record in the extra fields. Unfortunately, we couldn't use the attendee ID as the absolute identifier for Brushfire, as an attendee would get a different ID number for every event they attended. We'd try and match on name if we couldn't find the exact match, and we'd sort by the closest matches. And we also gave the user an option to reject all the potential matches and insert the new record. And this is what it looked like. Brushfire has authentication for their API as well, so that was set up. The name here, which would go into the add and update user ID from Donorfy, and this would be the Donorfy access key that Life Church set up that's specific to this application, and possibly the user as well. When the Life Church user logged on, they were able to select from the list of events that we pulled over from Brushfire, and then they were able to retrieve the attendees and were given a big list of attendees. They then clicked the Match to Donorfy button, which is where all this business logic happened. And the potential matches were color-coded. The white ones were just duplicate data we didn't consider. Green means there were definitely no matches and that new record would be added. Yellow meant that we found an exact match using the Brushfire event ID and attendee ID. And we'd present the user with a list of potential matches, which are the red and pink ones. And this got quite large, so this is only half the screen. This is the other half of the screen where their Donorfy details were. We gave them the constituent number and their name, address, email address, so they could look through that and select the box to choose the constituent, which was a lot of work, but it gave them the tools that they needed to find out which the actual constituent was. And what this looked like was something like this. This is the C# code for the API calls. And this is the C# code that's mostly the deduplication, but sets up the Brushfire lists and that sort of a thing. So it can get very complex once you're using those API calls in the real world. And at the end of it, we have in Donorfy the constituent with the matching email address from Brushfire, the contact details from Brushfire. There would be a tag with the Brushfire event details so that you could see at a glance they had attended that particular Brushfire event. If it was a new constituent, their recruitment campaign would be the Brushfire event, and there would be the activity, which included the event ID and attendee ID in the extra fields, and their contact preferences would be updated. So that's a fairly complex example. That took quite a lot of coding to do. Stu is now going to show you an application that he has developed with WooCommerce, taking a different approach using some other tools. So I'll stop sharing and hand over to Stu.
Great, thank you, Kylie. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Stuart Bailey. I'm director and co-founder of MAST. And what I'd like to do here is really kind of extend the examples and inspiration, if you like, that we're trying to give you around how the API could be used. Now, this is a completely fictitious example that we're going to be used, but it's really just to illustrate that how the API could be utilized. So what I'm going to be looking at is a demonstration of a link between, it happens to be WooCommerce, an e-commerce platform. It could be any e-commerce platform. And as Kylie and Sophie have said, you can link to pretty much from pretty much any other web-based system. In comparison to Kylie's example, which, as she said, was complex, there was a lot of coding to be done. What I'm going to show you is, in many respects, the other end of that, where maybe many of you will feel more comfortable, depending on your skill set. Some of you may be developers. So we're going to be looking at Power Automate. Now, the scenario that we've come up with in this instance, as I say, is we want to take an order from an online store and create a recurring payment instruction, an RPI within Donorfy. So what we're doing there is having the user log in to WooCommerce, which is very common in any e-commerce solution. That will be in the background authenticated. And then when the order is taken, it's passed over to Donorfy. It's passed over via a Power Automate script, which I'll show you in more detail. I'll share my screen in a moment. The scenario is when the order is taken, if the recipient, if it's gifted, is different to the payer, it will look up the constituent record. If necessary, it will create that record. The RPI will then be created to represent what we're creating as a sponsorship, and we'll also create an activity. So I would like to take you through that scenario and show you how we've utilized the API and the WooCommerce system to do that. So before we do anything else, what I'm going to do is share my screen and go into Power Automate. Now you've seen examples of this earlier. So the idea here is that we have a task, a job, a flow, depending on the terminology you're using, that is created to sit and to wait for a piece of information to be sent to it. Okay. Now Sophie showed you some screenshots. This is actually a live example looking at our test database, obviously. And we don't have time to go into a massive amount of detail around Power Automate or the other tools today, but I'd like to give you a kind of heads up and an indication that actually, if you're not a developer, I would say that you probably need maybe power user skills. What do I mean by that? So you're proficient in using Office or similar. And I would think that there's a massive amount of help online that you can tap into as well. And of course, as Kylie touched on, there are a bunch of friendly consultants out there that would be able to, certainly very willing to help you if you wanted to, if you needed that. So just in a bit more detail then, without going into a massive amount of it, we define within a task, you define what is waiting and what it's waiting for. So we're saying here, I'm just going to click on this and open it up. We've got a URL that sits there that will be called, okay? And importantly, again, going back to the examples earlier, there's a bunch of JSON that sits here that defines what it's expecting to receive. Now, what I'm defining here in this example is what WooCommerce will be sending it once it receives an order, okay? Again, an example, and probably overly simplified for the purposes of today. But if we just nip down it quite quickly, we've got recipient details. We've got a first name, last name, title. We've got a delivery address and contact details, etc. We've got information around the transaction. So how many, what type, is there a beneficiary involved, etc., etc. So really, you define that. You've defined your JSON that gets dropped in. Now, what then happens within a flow? Each of these are very much, Sophie called them drag and drop. I think that's a very good description. Not quite drag and drop, but you'll click pick and it will drop in. So you're not having to write code. You're not having to say, right, when this happens, do this. When this happens, do that, in something like C# or Visual Basic or whatever it might be that you're familiar with. But in this flow, I'm going down. We've defined what we're waiting for. We then set up some variables. Really, again, that sounds very programmy, but actually, you're dropping a box in and saying, I'm gonna put some values in this during this process. And then there's some very powerful functionality within Flow, which again is going to be very similar in your tool of choice. If it's not Flow, if it's not Logic Apps, it may be Zapier or one of the other tools that Sophie mentioned. The decision making. So the first stage we get to here is, well, actually, is this sponsorship gifted? If you remember the scenario that I outlined, the fictitious scenario, which is if the sponsorship is gifted, what we want to do is say, okay, we know that we've been passed a unique identifier for the payer, which has been previously authenticated, but we don't know about the recipient. So what we're going to do is say, we're going to have a look in Donorfy, make some API calls, which both Kylie and Sophie have touched on. So I'm hoping it's starting maybe to look a little familiar. But again, on each of these, we'll just click it to open it up. Do we have a beneficiary? So we've got conditions. We can say, if this meets that criteria, then do this. So in this case, I'm saying, have we got a gifted sponsorship? If we have, go down this path. If we haven't, don't do anything. So if we have got a gifted sponsorship, what we want to do is we want to go look it up in Donorfy. So what I'm going to do here is open up this call to the API, and what you'll see is, with the exception of this thing that I've dropped in here, which is just defining the API key, which the guys showed you earlier, this should look very familiar to the API strings that Sophie's mentioned, and Kylie was also running through on Postman. So we're running a search using the information that's been passed at the top of the script, and we're going to get some information back here again, and this is why it's really important that Sophie went through the JSON element, because everything is passed to and from the API using JSON. And then if we find, I'm skipping over here a little bit, as I say, because of time constraints, but do we then want to create do we need to create a new recipient? If we've already found a match, so if we did that lookup and actually the recipient already exists, then we can say, great, fine, that's brilliant. We'll grab the unique identifier, which we'll then use later on. If not, however, then what we're going to do is create a new constituent. Again, you'll see here that it's a very similar setup where you are specifying the API call here, and you're specifying down here in JSON format the data that you want to push in. So you'll see that it is JSON format, but what we're doing here is we're dropping in, and it really is click and pick here. So you can see that I'm clicking in there and it says, okay, what do you want to drop in? And these are all the attributes that are defined at the top of the script via us saying this is what we're expecting. So you literally click in there, drop it in, and when it runs, it will replace that. So when this runs, it will pass a create effectively constituent call to the API, passing in this information that has previously been passed to the whole flow. Hope I'm making myself clear there, without being able to run that through in massive detail. Then we get a response. You'll always get a response from the API, and then you can do stuff with that. So here we're telling it what we're expecting to get back. Again, good old JSON. And then we'll do something with it and say, right, actually, what I'd like you to do is pop the result of that into a variable, which is what we've defined higher up. That sounded a bit programming. If I just close that up, ultimately, when we hit this box here, what that's going to have done, I've opened it up, expanded it out, but essentially what it's doing is saying, we've got this piece of information, we've got this recipient, does this recipient exist? And what comes out the bottom of that is either the unique identifier for the person that's been found within Donorfy, so we've prevented a duplicate, or we can't find it, we create a new one, and it gives us the new unique identifier. Ultimately, though, we've now got the ability to create an RPI. Again, another API call, and I think as the guys have said, there are so many within the Donorfy API. Look for the documentation. There's so much you can do with it. In this example, we're literally just looking people up, creating a constituent, creating an RPI, and then creating an activity. But if we just open up the RPI, it should be starting to look familiar to you now. You've got the location of the API method you're calling. So in this, it's RPIs here. Again, we're passing in JSON. And again, in the same way as when we created a constituent, we're dropping in variables that have either been passed to us or we've extracted during the process. Likewise, we've got an activity call here. Okay, and again, we're dropping in variables or whatever we want to do. And there's a lot, because this example is very simple that we're leaving blank there. Ultimately, we get a response, and then finally, at the end of it all, we pass back to whatever has called this in the first place, which is typically going to be your website, and in this example, it's going to be WooCommerce. A bit of information to say, yeah, all's great, all sorted, or hang on, I had a bit of a problem. So let me now nip back. I'm conscious of time, but what I'd like to do is just very quickly, just to kind of mirror what Kylie did earlier and call this script. So I think the key point here is, just as you're calling the API from Postman, we can now call that script that we've written from Postman, which means we can call it from anywhere. So we grab the location, we're going to fire a post at it, we're going to define the JSON. This mirrors, if we went back to the task that we've just created, or the flow we just created, this is what it's expecting to receive. We pop all of that in, and then we could then submit that, okay? And if we do that, you'll get that result back saying, yeah, everything's fine. Here's your constituent ID of the person we've created, and here's the main constituent ID of the payer. Okay. So again, apologies for the slight whistle stop, but I just want to make sure we've got time for questions and answers. So let me now show you that in practice. Now, Sophie referred, both Sophie and Kylie have referred to our test Harry Potter database, and I've been forced to create a Dr. Dragon as an example. But the issue, the point we're making here is it can be any product. And what I'm going to illustrate here very quickly is the ability within WooCommerce. So what will happen here is I'm going to add that to the basket. Okay. And then I'm going to have a quick look at that. Forgive the layout of this. This is a kind of completely just installed example WooCommerce system, so we're not too concerned about how it looks. I'm going to go to the checkout here. I've got my details here because I'm logged in, so Donorfy knows who I am. I'm actually just going to say I'm going to give this to someone else, happens to be my sister, at a dummy address. Within WooCommerce, don't have time to go into a massive amount of WooCommerce stuff, but we're going to pay via a Donorfy API here, and I'm going to place that order. So what that's going to do is grab all the information from WooCommerce. It's going to call that script that we wrote that will go through, can it find the recipient, create the RPI, all of that good stuff. And when that comes back, we get an order received. And then the final part of that is popping into Donorfy. And then I will quickly go to my account here. And if we go here to my timeline, you'll see that there's a recurring payment that's been created. It's linked to my sister. We've got all the details that we passed. Now we made some assumptions here for the purposes of brevity, really. But we set up as a direct debit monthly. Whatever, that's all fine. But you can see that the allocation has been created. That has all been created with Donorfy, in Donorfy, directly from WooCommerce, call via that flow. So again, slightly whistle stop there, but hopefully just another indication of how you can use the API, how you could potentially use the API, and actually that you can do that with some skills that aren't fully developer skills by any means, a lot easier. So what I will do now is stop sharing and hand back to Sophie, I believe.
I just really wanted to summarize what we've talked through today. I know some of it's been very technical. I hope we haven't lost too many people along the way. I just wanted to really go over the basics of what we were trying to show. So APIs are a really powerful tool. They can do a lot. They can do things that are very simple. They can do things that are very complicated. And what you do with them is really up to you. They are a way of accessing your CRM data from outside the system. So using any external system, you can query, create, update, and delete your existing data within your CRM. The developers of the API keep that API code up to date for you, so you don't have to worry about all of the application logic that goes in behind it. If something changes in the main system, you don't have to worry about that as long as you're not using a deprecated function within that API. It is a way for you to incorporate your business logic into your integrations. So you're familiar with things like the Just Giving integration, which does everything for you. There are ways that you can alter that logic within Donorfy, but ultimately somebody else has developed that integration. This is a way of having more control over what happens in that middle portion, in the clever yellow box, if you will, that sits in between the external system and your Donorfy. You can work with the API with minimal development skills just to get started. So using Postman, you can have a little play and get used to it. There are lots and lots of tools available out there for working with the API and making API calls. So you can have a play with multiple different ones and see which one you get on best with. It's a way of automatically processing external data into your CRM. So if there are processes you have to go through on a daily or weekly or monthly basis that take up a lot of your time, are fiddly and complicated, this is a way of automating that process for you and saving yourself some headaches and working that process logic into hopefully a more foolproof way of doing things. And some of the demos got a little bit technical, but the take-home message from that is integrations can sit within the source system itself. So Stu showed you the WordPress site. He had a plugin within that WordPress site that made a call, fired a call off to that Power Automate. You could in theory, develop things that would sit within that website and do everything within the plugin itself. So they can sit on the left side of the diagram I showed within the source system, in the plugin. They can sit in a cloud-based middle section, so in that middle area of the yellow box in the cloud, or they can sit in a standalone application like Kylie showed you that she developed in WinForms. So you can, with either minimal skills, so in Power Automate, for example, that's a sort of power user end of the spectrum, all the way up to full-blown development side of things. You can write these integrations using the API.